So as many of you know, my name is Michael Penn. I teach in the Stanford Religious Studies Department. I wanted to welcome you to the final of 5 Ptarmigan mini lectures that have been taking place during the first half of 21. This series has showcased senior as well as exceptional junior faculty. But instead of delivering a traditional research presentation, we've asked participants to use the classroom lecture as their model. Especially given the strong audience numbers for each session, I'm delighted to announce that the series will continue next academic year. So expect to see details of next year's lineup towards the end of summer. For today, we've allotted exactly 1 hour for our speaker. As a result, I'll give an incredibly short introduction. Most importantly, during the presentation, please take advantage of the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Anuj Amin, one of our department's PhD students who has overseen this series, will curate submitted questions. So on to today's speaker. Rebecca Stevens Falcasantos is an assistant professor of religion at Amherst College. Last year, University of California Press published her book, Constantinople, Ritual, Violence, and Memory in the Making of a Christian Imperial Capital. In part based on this work, tonight she'll be talking to us about Constantinople. So please.
Well, first, good afternoon and evening. It's 8 o'clock my time. And in case there's anyone on the other side of the world, good morning to you. I'm honored to join you. I feel like I'm following some big footsteps, and humbled to join you. And I want to start by thanking Professor Michael Penn and the Stanford's Department of Religious Studies for the invitation, the Ptarmigan Fund for funding the series, and for Anuj Amin for his skillful handling of logistics. My topic for today is Constantinople, which is a rather expansive topic to be sure, and one not fully digestible in the course of an hour. I forgot to go ahead and share my screen, so just give me one moment. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. But in line with the purpose of this lecture series, my goal is to provide an introduction to the late antique city. For the sake of time, I will only take us through the 5th century. And as my interests involve ritual environments, I'll focus in particular on the development of the city's physical ritual landscape, what living in that landscape may have looked like, and how the intersection of landscape and ritual was involved in the so-called Christianization of the later Roman Mediterranean. I'll begin from a position of assuming that some of our attendees are completely unfamiliar with Constantinople and its history. So please indulge me as I provide a few brief contextualizing remarks before discussing the late antique city. Constantinople, now Istanbul, was founded, or rather refounded, in November 324 CE and subsequently dedicated on May 11, 330, by the Emperor Constantine at the site of an earlier Greek settlement, Byzantium, located on a peninsula on the European side of the Bosphorus, where it meets the Sea of Marmara. Here's a better image of that, so you can see where on the peninsula that is. Over the following century, the city became the administrative and cultural capital of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, a status it would hold until 1453, when it was conquered by Mehmed II. Even then, it became the capital of the Ottoman Empire until the foundation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. And while no longer a capital city in an administrative sense, Istanbul remains a central space in contestations over Greek and Turkish heritage. But let us return to our purpose, that is, thinking about Constantinople in late antiquity. In the century after Constantine established the city as his dynastic capital, Constantinople's landscape was reorganized, not only through monumental accretions under Constantine and his successors, but also through rhetoric, incidents of violence between competing religious groups, legislative restrictions, and religious practices, or ritual practices. Identification of Constantinople as a Christian city, tentative under Constantine, became more pronounced during Constantius's reign, with the construction of the Great Church and the establishment of the city's earliest Christian monasteries. Whether that identification bore out on the ground is unclear. Most of our sources for the period are Christian authors with an interest in asserting the Christian character of the city. Under the reigns of Theodosius I and Arcadius, Nicene clergy gained control of Constantinople's churches and seem to have finally pushed out the ancient temples, a situation that contributed to efforts to cast orthodoxy in their own terms. And then, during the first half of the 5th century, under the Emperor Theodosius II, the definitional lines between orthodoxy and heresy were progressively strengthened, and demands for religious conformity in Constantinople were asserted with increasingly vigorous and coercive means, manifested not only in the rhetoric of local historiographers, but also in imperial legislation preserved in the Theodosian Code. This foundation laid, my map for the remainder of the lecture is as you see on the slide here. First, I'll provide an overview of the city's history to the first half of the 5th century. Then I'll summarize the city's cult sites in order to get a sense of its cult menu, if you will. And importantly, to think about how its inhabitants would have experienced the city and what it means to talk about a city's Christianization. And finally, if we have time, I'll offer some thoughts on how ritual transformation occurred within this space. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the imperial succession in the Eastern Roman Empire during late antiquity, when the Christianization of the city occurred, I offer you this slide for orientation. Any discussion of Constantinople's development, and especially its religious development, must acknowledge that a multi-layered history of ideological claims distorts our view of the city almost from the moment of its founding, refounding, by Constantine in 324 and dedication in 330. For example, Eusebius of Caesarea, in his Life of Constantine, claims that Constantine founded the city to be fully devoted to Christ. In a similar vein, some 5th century authors were concerned enough about maintaining the city's orthodox purity that they actively suppressed or even erased pre-Constantinian landmarks from their narrative maps. An interesting example in this case is the Notitia Urbis Constantinopolitanae, which omits several important landmarks that were almost assuredly present at the time of its composition in the 420s, perhaps because its producer considered these sites not sufficiently or properly Christian. And this is not to mention the accretion of legends and the contestations that occurred during the Byzantine and Ottoman periods and continue to occur today. While that history is interesting in itself, my focus, as I've mentioned, is to guide you through the information we have about the late antique city. As we proceed, I want to make clear that much of our reconstruction of the ancient city is conjectural. I would even say romanticized, since archaeological access to the earliest layers of the city is extremely limited, forcing us to rely on literary sources that sometimes disagree. Some details are firmer than others, and at the end of this section, I'll briefly summarize what we have by way of material remains. So let me grab a quick drink, and I'll take you through the history. We know frustratingly little about Byzantium or its layout prior to the Roman period, aside from scattered literary references such as Herodotus, Xenophon, Thucydides, Diodorus, and Diodorus Siculus. But from this evidence, we know that the town predated Constantine by nearly 1,000 years, founded, according to legend, in the 7th century BCE by the eponymous Bizos of Megara. The settlement formed around high ground on the northeast tip of the peninsula, often referred to as the Acropolis. I am now showing a slide with a rough map of that settlement, noting that the map is constructed by from literary sources. As far as I know, we have no archaeological remains from these particular sites. I've also tried to make these slides as accessible as possible, and I apologize if I have failed. Our sources mention temples to Apollo, Artemis, and Aphrodite on the Acropolis, flanked by a theater and amphitheater on the Acropolis's eastern slope. We also have references to temples for Zeus, Poseidon, and Dionysus, as well as an altar for Athena Ecbasia and a grove dedicated to Demeter, although we do not know their locations. 2 harbors were situated along the northern shore. A parade ground known as the Stradigian was located to their south, between the Acropolis and the wall that ran along the peninsula to the west. Byzantium made an alliance with Rome in 146 BCE, and as far as we can tell, for the next few centuries remained relatively undistinguished, but apparently prosperous because of tariffs levied against ships passing through the Bosphorus. During the late 2nd century CE, Byzantium, like much of the empire, became involved in the war between Septimius Severus and Pescennius Niger. Those familiar with imperial history will know that Severus won that war in 195, and in retaliation for the town's support of Niger, Severus razed Byzantium's walls and perhaps a significant portion of the town itself, and then reorganized the site as the Colonia Antonina. The colony extended southwest from the Acropolis, and I'm now showing a slide of Severus's colony. Some of the monumental features of the new colony are a bit more certain and become important in the late antique city. Reportedly, the Acropolis complex survived, as did the harbors and Strategion. To this was added, and I'm going to move south from the Acropolis, a basilica complex, a forum called the Tetrastoon, which was located across from the basilica, a monumental bath complex known as the Baths of Zeuxippus, a hippodrome, and colonnaded streets, the most important of which is this one, number 7, which ran west from the Tetrastoon between the basilica and the hippodrome. This would become the beginning of the main east-west avenue of the city, known as the Meze. And so now we can move to the city's development under Constantine, often presented as the first Christian emperor, a description that we know is complicated, if not inaccurate and anachronistic. 2 months after defeating his son-in-law and rival Licinius in September 324, Constantine chose Byzantium as the site of his new dynastic capital. What drew Constantine to this particular city is unclear. One hypothesis is that Licinius had used the town as his own capital, in which case Constantine's choice of Byzantium would have been akin to Severus's engagement with the site over a century earlier. Now, as Guibert d'Agron observes, this would suggest significant parallels between the activity of Severus and Constantine, enough to remind us that we are dealing with ideologically shaped narratives, ones that often trade on the actions of earlier emperors to legitimate the actions of later emperors. In other words, we should be cautious about the mythic histories that they trade in. But whatever Constantine's motives, Byzantium was clearly advantageous for a number of reasons, not least because of its location at the end of the Via Egnatia before crossing the Bosphorus into Asia. Thus, while it would be decades before Constantinople surpassed other regional capitals, it nonetheless offered a convenient staging point for regular imperial movement into the eastern provinces. So, let's walk through this supposedly Christian city. Constantine began by extending the city's walls 3 kilometers to the west, quadrupling its land area, supposedly following the ancient rites of limitatio. Within this space, he, and let's be honest here, his civic planners, built upon the existing residences of antiquity. On the one hand, built upon the existing residence of antiquity on the one hand, and Roman imperialism on the other, visually cultivating the city's existing Greek and Roman monuments. As Sarah Bassett, Franz Alterbauer, and others have previously noted, this program relied on an interconnected series of architectural complexes along the city's main avenues, which I show on this slide. So I'm going to take these complexes in turn. You'll recognize by now the earlier monuments of Byzantium on the Acropolis and the Severan foundations on the Acropolis's south, the Basilica, the Tetrastoon, now rededicated as an Augusteon, housing images of the imperial family, the Baths of Zeuxippus, and the Hippodrome. But we also see some important additions, namely a monumental Christian temple, Aia Arini, between the Acropolis and the Severan monuments, effectively tying the two areas together, the Milion, marking the terminus of the Meze between the Basilica and the Augusteon, and a palace located to the south of the Baths and east of the Hippodrome. I'll note that we do not have a precise location or building plans for the palace, although there is quite a bit of speculation on what this would have looked like. Along the Meze to the west of the old Civic Center, immediately outside the Severn walls, right here, was the Forum of Constantine. At its center stood the porphyry column of Constantine, atop which was an image of the emperor adorned with a solar crown. Flanking the Forum were additional structures with imperial residences, namely a Senate house, a praetorium, and a prison, and an nymphaeum. Further west along the Meze, were divided into two branches, stood another imperial complex, consisting of the Capitolium and the Philadelpheion. As with similar monuments in other cities, the Capitolium was dedicated to the Capitoline Triad and asserted Constantinople's ties to Rome and its traditional institutions. The Philadelpheion represented the former harmony between members of the Tetrarchy, and as such, it asserted Constantine's connection to Diocletian and earlier imperial ideologies. On the northern branch of the Meze, at the highest point in the city, Constantine built the Apostoleion, or the Church of the Holy Apostles, which was to be his mausoleum, perhaps in conscious imitation of the mausoleum of Augustus, which stood within the walls of Rome. At this point, the development of the city took off, so I'll only take another minute to draw your attention to important additions to the monumental map made from Constantine's death in 337 through the reign of Theodosius II. And again, I've attempted to make this as accessible as possible. Right. So first we can't see my own map here. Here we go. Right. All right. First we have the addition of the great church, or Hagia Sophia, built under Constantius and located between Hagia Irene and the Augusteion. The church suffered extensive fire damage in riots at the beginning of the 5th century after the expulsion of the bishop John Chrysostom, and reconstruction of the church occurred from 404 to 415. We also have reported renovations or additions to the Apostoleion under Constantius. We have the addition of the harbor of Julian on the southern coast of the peninsula. We have monumental accretions in the Hippodrome. We have two new forums. The first is the Forum of Theodosius, and the second is the Forum of Arcadius. We have new palace constructions built near the Great Palace, including the Palace of Placidia, the House of Placidia Augusta, and the Palace of Marina. And then we have, I guess I didn't mark that out. We have another massive expansion of the city under Theodosius with the construction of the Theodosian walls beginning in 413. Now, I'm just going to take a very brief moment to try to summarize the archaeological evidence we have for our period. For the Constantinian city, this is restricted to the foundations of the Hippodrome and the base and column that held Constantine's statue in the form of Constantine. The statue itself fell in 1106. The archaeological remains of the Theodosian city are not much better. Extant are some of the monuments lining the Hippodrome Spina, portions of the triumphal arch in the form of Theodosius, portions of two palaces of the north of the Hippodrome, the base for a statue of an empress in the Augusteion, and sections of land and sea walls. Cyril Mango traced segments of the Meze in the modern city. And then we have some of the original great church. We only have the Propylaeon and the Pronaos, which were excavated in 1935, but most of that structure lies under the current Hagia Sophia. Those excavations also uncovered a street running perpendicular to the great church. And I'm admittedly leaving aside quite a bit of scattered archaeological remains. If you're interested, I recommend The Byzantine Legacy, which has a phenomenal Flickr account. But what I hope you noticed as I walked us through the building history of the city is that despite claims that Constantine had defunded traditional cults, their temples remained in Constantinople until at least the later 4th century. And this is a situation that we find in other Roman cities. And so I want to take a moment to summarize those sites in order to situate them within the context of local and or trans-regional cult. I'll say now that my classifications are, and my pages are sticking together, I'll say now that my classifications here are somewhat fluid since disentangling the two are complicated. For example, how should we categorize Hagia Irene or the Great Church? Both monumental structures with imperial ties where liturgies directed specifically toward Christ were held. Such sites clearly engage with, or rather impose engagement with, a trans-regional, indeed a universal cult, to use Roman terms, or religion anywhere, to use J.Z. Smith's phrase. At the same time, however, it is a local manifestation or representation of that cult, in much the same way that a Capitolium is the local representation of Rome's Capitoline Triad. Other sites, like the Tuci, or local martyr shrines, local in the sense that they had not been exported to other locations, are peculiar to the city. But even then, they resonate with similar sites in other cities, so they are not entirely local. And then how should we categorize shrines for martyr cults that have been imported into the city, like the 40 Martyrs of Sebastia, or spaces said to house relics of, say, Stephen the Protomartyr, the True Cross, or Mary's Girdle? On the one hand, we have material objects anchoring the cult in a highly local way. On the other, they draw attention to places far away. So first, local cult sites, both traditional and Christian. Here I would include the temples on the Acropolis and perhaps other pre-Christian, pre-Constantinian temples. Depending on the source, they were either closed by Constantine or by Theodosius I. But if they're present in the city, I think we need to take them seriously. We also have a shrine to the Tuci of the city, which is the tutelary deity that promoted the city's fortune and prosperity. We have testimony for the continuation of its cult into at least the 5th century. We also have a shrine of the Dioscuri in the Hippodrome. What kind of cult they received is unclear. And then we have a number of local martyr shrines. For example, the local martyrs Paul, Mucius, Martyrius, and Marcianus, among others that I don't have time to mention here. I'll also say that while we know where some of these martyria were, there is disagreement over the location of others. As for trans-regional sites, we have the following. We have the Capitolium. We have the Hippodrome, where ritualized interactions with the emperor sometimes bled into penitential and imprecatory litanies in response to natural disasters. And we have similar, if later, references to imprecatory ambulation on the city's walls. We have monumental Christian churches, particularly Hagia Irene and the Great Church, which I see to be analogous to the great state temples of Rome. And over the course of the 4th century, other churches joined these two sites, some transitioning from local to transregional as they became more closely tied to the imperial family and were monumentalized. An example of this would be Gregory of Nazianzus' Anastasia Church. And then we have martyria associated with imperial cults and their relics. These include the 40 Martyrs of Sebastia, John the Baptist, and various relics like the True Cross and the Girdle of Mary that were deposited at the base of the column of Constantine. And finally, I include in this category transregional cult elements of imperial cult, although with some hesitation. It's unclear whether imperial cult continued under Constantine and his successors, at least in this city. But I think that there are a few spaces that would have lent themselves to the continuation of these types of activities. So one would have been the Augustaion, that site that was mentioned, that I mentioned a few moments ago, where the statues of the imperial family had been placed. And we have evidence of games and incense and proskynesis or prostration occurring in front of those statues. Another place that I think we could have had some imperial cult activity would have been in the form of Constantine before the statue there. The 5th century historian Philostorgius, who lived in the city, describes the veneration of the image. And he describes the inclusion of burning lamps, incense, and intercessory prayers. He himself does not interpret these acts as just honoring the emperor. He sees them as part of a traditional pattern of worshiping the emperor as a god. And then a third potential site would have been Constantine's mausoleum. Considering the strong resonance of traditional cultic structures elsewhere in the city, I think it's plausible that many people in the early decades, particularly those without strong commitments to Christianity, would have experienced the site as they would earlier mausolea. That is, they would have seen it as a site for the ritualized veneration of a divinized emperor. And we see hints of this type of veneration described by Eusebius in the life of Constantine, although he's otherwise very careful to rhetorically construct this site as a Christian church. But this brief summary does not claim to be exhaustive, but I hope it provides a good sense of how diverse the cultic menu in Constantinople was, at least in theory. This would have been particularly true during the earlier years of the period, and likely fluctuated and eventually waned as the 4th century progressed. What I think is most important in thinking about the late antique city is this: it was a rapidly expanding and inherently unstable environment. Initially, it was not decidedly Christian, nor did Constantine eradicate elements that were pagan, pre or non-Christian or traditionalist or whatever nomenclature we decide to use. All that's problematic. Rather, Constantine's building program largely preserved the inherited civic landscape, including its prominent temples, even while expanding the available canvas, so to speak. This stressed the city's continuity with classical foundation narratives and genealogies. And indeed, the Christian footprint of the city was limited to 2 sites, namely Iarini and the Apostoleion. And I think the Apostoleion was ambiguously Christian at best. By the end of the 4th century, however, the landscape had become discernibly Christian, with the reported closure of the traditional temples and the accretion of assertively Christian architecture. That is, churches, martyria, monasteries, as well as the importation and deposition of relics. Okay. Now, what does this mean in terms of transformations of the city's ritual patterns? For one, I think it's important to consider what categories govern those patterns. Would they have been primarily concerned about which gods one worshipped or which Christian doctrine one subscribed to? Or would the average person have been more alert to how particular practices belong to their households, their neighborhoods, city, or empire? Once monasteries began to appear, how were those spaces incorporated into the local, and here I mean very local, ritual environment? How would people have engaged the temples on the Acropolis? These are difficult questions to answer, especially when we're dealing with sources like Eusebius and John Chrysostom, who are quite purposeful in drawing clear fences between Christian and not Christian, between orthodoxy and heresy, which becomes itself another form of not Christian. But my own suspicion is that throughout the 4th and early 5th century, many people would not have found it strange to see traditional cult sites side by side with Christian temples, and perhaps would have visited whatever sites served their purpose. The average person might not recognize cult sites, agents, and events as efficacious. They might have recognized cult sites, agents, and events as efficacious when they did what they were meant to do, or when they were regarded as legitimately representing the consensus of the city or empire. In other words, such persons would not see a distinction between Christian and not Christian, much less distinctions between Christian and Christian, until they were alerted to the fact that it mattered. And this, I think, alerts us to the delicate and sometimes explosive interplays between a changing monumental landscape and influential people bent on controlling how that landscape is understood. So let me conclude with a possible example. One night in the early 5th century, a crowd assembled near the imperial palace in Constantinople. This group was preparing to escort the relics of certain martyrs that had been placed in a casket and covered in a veil and had recently arrived in the city from across the Bosphorus. Now they were to be moved from their temporary location in the great church to their new home in a martyrion in Drybia, a suburb 9 miles to the west. The Empress Aelia Eudoxia herself would lead the procession as it traversed the entire length of the city. Upon arriving at the Martyrion, the crowd would settle in to await the dawn and the arrival of the Emperor Arcadius with his army, while the city's bishop, John Chrysostom, delivered an animated homily describing the journey they had undertaken during the past few hours. The multi-day festival appears to have utilized several processional routes, as the relics initially arrived by a water procession and escorted the short distance from the shore to the great church. After some time there, they were then processed out the city, most likely along the Mese, through the Hebdomon, which is a suburb or military camp just outside the city's wall, and further along the Via Egnatia to Drepia. Now, this is a somewhat anachronistic map, but with the landmarks and speculated housing, hopefully it gives us a sense of what type of physical environment those involved in the procession would have met, right? Consider the number of monuments they would have encountered. The great church, passing through the Augusteion, the Basilica, and the Hippodrome, the baths and palace at a close distance, the Forum of Constantine with its Senate, the Forum of Theodosius, the Forum of Arcadius, and this is not to mention any number of churches, monasteries, martyria, and shrines, including those for the city's Tuki or the old gods, or even the many sites memorialized in Christian accounts that I have not mentioned. For example, the latrine behind the Forum of Constantine where Arius was said to have passed. This was a landscape filled with tension between ancient and new, tension over older gods and Christ and Christian martyrs, tension between Christian clerics over the definition of orthodoxy, between cleric and ascetic, between Christian leaders and the imperial family, and untold tensions between multitudes of unknown participants. How would the people within the performative spaces of the festival have engaged the physical spaces through which they processed? I'm reminded of the many public gatherings and quasi-liturgical processions of the past several years. Women's marches, rallies in Charlottesville, Black Lives Matter protests, even the January 6th insurrection. These events are not eruptions of mounting public sentiment. I mean, they are, but they are not simply this. Rather, such gatherings elevate and hone, reinforce and strengthen. They draw individuals together into a group and direct them toward an idea of what should be. Such events reshape the meaning of the space, sometimes in subtle, sometimes in significant ways, and they reverberate through public discourses. In other words, a procession is a space with the potential to do something, to rewrite physical space and social relations. It's often difficult to observe this in the late antique city, but as we think about what we think we know about the physical landscape and the ritual patterns of late antique Constantinople, we can ask some imaginative questions. Would the people have actively thought of the procession as Christian, as understanding themselves as doing an eminently Christian thing? Or did they have to be reminded by hymns, by crosses, by vestments, by the bishop and his clergy, by virgins and monks? Would they have thought of the physical spaces as Christian? Had the quote unquote pagan features of their landscape already been recast, stripped of their paganness? Or was it washed over during the procession, obscured by the dark of night, by the flicker of candle? Did the procession itself transform the physical landscape, if only for a few hours? Was that transformation strong enough to persist beyond the space of the procession? How did such transformations, if they occurred, expand to notions about empire? And I'm thinking here of the three imperial fora about the three imperial fora that the people processed through, as well as the roles played by the emperor and empress in the procession. And did this procession provoke a response from those who thought Christians, or these Christians, had gained too much control of the city and empire? Could that response have led to violence? And after all, we know that other processions led by John Chrysostom did. Now, there are many things that happen in ritual environments, and I don't have the time to pull apart the various theoretical lenses we could apply here. But I hope that what I've been able to do in the past 40 minutes, I guess it's a little less than 40 minutes, is open up the possibilities to help you think about Constantinople and other cities as living, negotiated spaces, as places where people can test what it means to be, or maybe we should say do, Christianity, to think about the meanings of spaces, how the meanings of spaces change as that doing happens. I've perhaps spent too much time building the landscape for you, especially when so little of that landscape survives. But then the evidence we have of that landscape has itself been shaped by the rituals, by the people who used those rituals to shape. So, to briefly review what we've covered this afternoon. First, we looked at the history of Constantinople, beginning with its hazy mythical past to its somewhat less hazy development under the Constantinian and Theodosian dynasties. We focused on the monumental architecture that became a patrimony that those who lived in the city found themselves negotiating in various ways. Then we surveyed the spaces specifically associated with cult ritual. I've suggested thinking about spaces in terms of local and extra local or regional resonances, while recognizing that parsing between them is complicated. Importantly, my aim here was to remind us that Constantinople was not a clean ritual landscape. And I caution us against imagining that people would have confined their ritual activity to a single religion. That's not to say there weren't people who clearly and aggressively asserted their identification as Christian. Spoiler, there were. But we should recognize that things on the ground were potentially messier than those people would have wanted. And finally, I offered an example of how ritual activity within that landscape, namely a relic procession, may have contributed to reinterpretations of the inherited landscape. Or to put it another way, to think about how such communal events were not simply expressions of changes in local piety, but rather crucial tools in religious change. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
It's the lecture format kind of prevents the sound of applause from coming through, but I assure you they're there. First off, that was an amazing presentation and really appreciate it. I just kind of also want to let everyone know that Professor Falcasantos has actually created a bibliography. And after our meeting here today, I'll be circulating it to all of the individuals in attendance. So you guys can have a reference for this discussion. And so without further ado, I kind of want to just jump into a few questions if that works for you.
That's fine.
Awesome. Okay, so one of the things that seems really interesting to me is this idea of romanticization, the romanticization of Constantinople. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how scholars kind of deal with that problem? Often, we bring a lot of our own modern biases. We have to deal with the question of alterity, and I could just kind of want to know safeguards that we might have in our scholarship for kind of reconstructing identities.
So one of the ways that scholars do this is by really hedging their language. You've noticed that I did it a couple of times in terms of like, we know where some of these sites are, we don't know where other of these sites are. Bringing in maps is actually pretty problematic because once you see something on a map, you think, oh, that's where it was. The fact that, so the maps that most of the maps I used were from Sarah Bassett's book. And she's very careful not to give specific locations. She gives kind of a general location generally. And that's one way to try to push back against the romanticization of the city. Another way is to just really try to dig into the evidence that we have when we have it. And that does not always happen with Constantinople. If you look through some of the literature that I sent, or that it's in the bibliography, sometimes you have people who are just piling in details, and then other people are much more careful.
Okay, yeah. And so, then just to kind of continue on this idea of scholarship, I know that in studying Byzantium, especially with Hagia Sophia, there are a lot of individuals who focus on sensorial perceptions that are associated with the city. And I'm just kind of curious, how do you see that fitting into 5th century scholarship? Do you think that sensation and understanding like perception And sorry not to jump the gun. I mean, clearly there are a few archaeological holes. So kind of how do we do that accurately?
Yeah, and so when I was working on the book and actually the dissertation beforehand, this was a question that was something that I wrestled with quite a bit. As you saw, like before the 6th century, our knowledge is really scarce. Um, I've used theory to try to extrapolate and hypothesize how these things would have occurred. We know that there were churches. We know that Irene was there. We might not know what it looked like, and we might not know what its space felt like, but we do know that it was a space and that people were engaging in this space in some ways. And so there we're doing some kind of imaginative or creative hypothesizing about how people were engaging in the space.
Okay. Um, and so I'm going to kind of turn our attention then. I've talked a little bit about scholarship and the way that we've approached it, but I have a few questions here from the audience that I think are really cool to ask now to maybe get a few more concrete, perhaps, answers. But what do we kind of know about the city planners that Constantine employed? Were they Christian? Just any information that you might have there.
No idea. If someone else knows, I would love to know. But everyone, well, not everyone, but most people, when they're talking about Constantine founding or rededicating, there was a Twitter eruption last week about, can we stop talking about Constantine founding the city? And I appreciate that. But most of the time when we talk about this, we just kind of slip into, oh, Constantine planned this and Constantine planned that. And, he was the one who was behind the way the the way the Apostolion, the Church of the Holy Apostles, was constructed. I have a hard time seeing him as an architect. I'm sure someone else was doing that work, but no one really mentions it. So I don't know if they I don't know if they were Christian or traditionalists or Jewish or even if those categories are really good categories to use for 324.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like that's always kind of the question asked there. But, just maybe just a brief follow-up on that question is, do you know if there was an education system that was kind of robust there that individuals who would work closely with Constantine and who would work for the empire may have kind of gone through?
I know that there were artisans that would travel from city to city. That's not an area that I have delved as much into. But I imagine again, I'm happy to be corrected on this. But I imagine that there were architects that would be considered skilled and in demand for massive building projects. The mechanisms behind that's a good question, and I want to learn more.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I did want to turn and take another question from an audience member, and someone's asked whether or how actually the wealth of a port city affects its openness to multiple identities. So Christian and pagan, or is it multiple practices again, such as Christian and pagan?
That's a really good question, and I hadn't thought about it, but I think that might. I think that might play into some of it. The fact that it is clearly tied to the imperial family after Constantine's refounding, rededication. We have legends of a previous Christian settlement in Byzantium prior to 324, but those are later, and I'm really hesitant about trusting them. But once you have the imperial family and they're importing, and Constantius himself, so Constantine's son, imports a pretty vast aristocratic population so that he can populate a senate there. But with a city like that drawing a population, maybe ports and harbors are important here, but I think also the fact that it's an imperial city and that power is getting consolidated. And so in that way, it's like Antioch in terms of being a hub.
Okay. And so kind of then I just want to continue on this vein because I think it's opened up a really, really interesting area of inquiry. One of the aspects of your presentation was this discussion of processional spaces. and kind of how over time they reinvent their identities, or new identities are put onto them. Maybe some identities might be ablated. Were there any static aspects of these places that, we as historians could kind of cling on? I think one of the things that we all probably in the field struggle with are like changing like identities. And so kind of the static aspects of it might be helpful to look at.
Yeah, I mean, so here I think we need to tease out different layers, right? So we have some buildings that once they're there for a while. But then we have, especially in Constantinople, we have the continual accretion of new monuments. And I think whenever a new monument is placed in a space, it changes the sense of the space. When you construct Hagia Sophia, or the Great Church, in close proximity to these older Severan foundations, that changes the space, and it changes the way that people are engaging in the space. So I don't know if you can even talk about the space as being static unless building has stopped, right? And even then you have people moving into the space, and you have new generations moving into the space, and what one generation tells the next generation is going to be constantly changing. So I'm thinking in terms of, sorry, hold on. Thinking in terms of the mall in DC, right? That's a space that is constantly being, there's new accretions, maybe not as quickly as Constantinople sometimes, but there's new accretions. And you constantly have people living in the city, but you also have visitors coming to the city, and it's kind of a playground of discourse that is continually evolving. I don't know. I think I want to resist the static.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's, I think, and then then let's continue a little bit further then with the question of dynamism. I think you also kind of mentioned that local ritual environments kind of played a huge role in Constantine during this time, that the idea of religion itself was something we should look at both from the imperial side of things, but also really from the local side of things. What kind of would that have looked like, right? We're dealing with a history that was already existent in this land, and as we introduce Christianity into the landscape, what would the locality may have looked like? Is it, obviously on one hand it must have been super diverse, but on the other hand, maybe you might know a little bit more.
Yeah, so about what we know is what I've told you. We know that there's there's diversity on the ground. I tend to think in terms of the identification of cult sites rather than the identification of people, right? So if I'm going to hypothesize a neighborhood in Constantinople, what would a person in that neighborhood come in contact with? I suspect, and again, like, we're dealing with incomplete evidence here, but I suspect that there are probably neighborhood shrines like you would find in almost any other Mediterranean city. I suspect that as we move forward in the 4th century, there might be, maybe next door is a monastery. Is that person making some kind of, is it that person interacting with some kind of on-street shrine and then going to the chapel at the monastery, or going to see the ascetics, the monks in the monastery for some kind of instruction? Are they then engaging in a relic procession? And I often think that relic processions are very much like parades, right? You get caught up in the parade. You might not plan to go to a parade, but you might get stuck on the sidelines, or maybe you will join in on a parade. What happens when you join something like that? Does your understanding of the activity that you're engaging in change, or does someone else have to help that activity change for you?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, and I think someone's kind of followed up on this point here. We have another audience question, and is there a way that these different belief systems work as longitudinal cultural identities for groups primarily? Perhaps it would be relevant for these folks to think of themselves as pagan and Christian due to the history and tradition of the city.
Okay, so say that one more time.
Sure. So I think the question is really kind of trying to understand longitudinal cultural identities for groups.
Mhm.
So what the different types of groups in the cities looked like. On one hand, we're talking about localized ritual environments, so understanding shrines and processions and kind of what that would have looked like. But when we look more, obviously the taxonomy issue here, but when we look at everything more as a group longitudinally, what can we kind of expect to see?
Yeah, so I'm going to use the top down
Mhm.
instead. So like someone like John Chrysostom would see, because he wants to see very strong, clear boundaries. And when those boundaries are not in place, he gets mad. And we see this in his homilies in Antioch when he's complaining about his Christians, and I'm going to use scare quotes here, but his Christians going to Jewish synagogues. I think that's a great example of people engaging in local sites in ways that someone like John Chrysostom or someone like Eusebius or some of the other, I'm going to lean on the language of cultural producers, would want to be like very strong boundaries. So I think that with some people, like these identifications would be very, very strong, and they would want other people's identifications to also be very, very strong. Um, I'm more hesitant to make a claim that that's always the case. And I fall in line with the theory of like what Eric Rebiard has written in his Christians and Many Identities, that identifications are situational, right? And that they're activated in particular contexts. Um, and those contexts might be in the space of a homily given by John Chrysostom. You Christians, what are you doing? Why are you going to the bars on the way home from the relic procession? Or, why are you going to the games? He hated the games, right? So they have to be called to mind. But repeated calling to mind then solidifies those identifications.
Okay, okay. And so we've kind of talked then in this case a lot about local identity, local ritual environments. There was something that you had mentioned that you vision Hagia Sophia and Hagia Irene as comparable to the temples in Rome.
Mhm.
Could you just expand on that a little bit, maybe in terms of function, maybe in terms of ritual, just kind of the elements you might have meant by that?
Yeah, so I see them as monumental architecture, and I see them taking on, and so later on, so with Theodosius the first, and especially with Theodosius the second, they're like the primary kind of imaginative centers of what it means to be imperial and what it means to be Christian, and so they get kind of um, solidified in a way that I would think of the Temple of Zeus in Rome, right? Whether or not lots and lots of people go to them for a liturgy, I think is less important than the fact that they are present and they are very visible. Earlier in the period, that's a little bit more hesitant, but the fact that they were constructed as monumental pieces makes me think that they are meant as votive offerings in the way that some of the temples in Rome were constructed as votive offerings.
Okay, okay, that's awesome. And so we're just about running to the end of our time, and I wanted to give just one last question, and then I wanted to give you just the last few minutes to maybe talk us through bibliography and point out the structure of it, if that would be helpful for you. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so we did receive one question, and just kind of in your research, what potentially was the most exciting aspect of it that you kind of ran into, or the most surprising that you ran into?
Uh, I think it was, I mean, this sounds really horrible. I think it was the conflicts that happen in ritual spaces. Um, Thinking about how we can have competing rituals side by side, and then how violence can happen from those rituals and the types of reconfigurations that happen in the wake of violence. Um, Realizing that these spaces are spaces of contestation was I found that to be really a powerful moment to come across.
Yeah, and now I'm really interested. So I lied. I'm gonna have one more question. Are there multiple instances of these violence that we kind of see in the texts? Like are they preserved archaeologically? How do you see them?
So not archaeologically, but we have references in Socrates of Constantinople, his ecclesiastical history, and he mentions quite a few incidents of violence. There's supposedly over 3,000 Christians again, categories, right? But 3,000 people slaughtered in the Church of Iarini in confrontations between Arians and Nicenes. And like there's multiple accounts of violence in his history and also in Sozomen's history.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's I'm gonna definitely bookmark that. That's very interesting. I'll definitely have to look into it. So we do have about 2 more minutes. Do you want to maybe just talk us through the collected scholars in your bibliography?
Yeah, I don't have the bibliography right in front of me, but I pulled out some of the more important works on the architectural investigations. There's some works on inscriptions. It's all alphabetical. I did not organize it by topic, and I apologize for that. There are a couple of, like, I think 15th and 16th century pieces on there that are some of our earliest surveys of Constantinople in European languages. And so they are very influential because they preserve monuments that aren't preserved elsewhere now, but they had access to them before they were dismantled in whatever way they were dismantled. And then there's, I'm trying to think of what else. There's also some work on there by scholars looking at John Chrysostom and the way he's engaging in Constantinople.
Okay. Well, that's phenomenal. I think I just as a reminder, I'll send everyone the bibliography that was here. And many of us are graduate students, so I can imagine studying for prelims will be much easier with that aid. So
And you're welcome to contact me too if you're interested in some of the other material that's not on the bibliography.
perfect. I'll also be sure to then share your email address in the email that I send out with everyone, just in case. So, well, again, thank you so much. We are just at time now. Really amazing lecture, and again,
Thank you.
round of applause for me. So, thank you.